What's up, everybody? Welcome back to another episode of One Big Question with Renee Smith. I'm your host, your guide, your favorite deep thinker next door, Renee Smith, and today is Saturday, April 12th, 2025. Whether you're tuning in from your car, your kitchen, or your cozy couch with coffee in hand, I'm glad you're here. Now, if you're new around here, first of all, welcome, you're in for a ride. Every week, we take one big, juicy question and we unpack it. No fluff, no filler, just real talk, real insight, and maybe a little bit of sass. You know how we do it. So today's big question is a good one, and I'm already fired up about it. But before we dive in, take a breath, get comfy, and let's get curious together. You ready? I know I am. Let's go. Price for a cup of coffee in the US is going up as tariffs put the squeeze on local cafe and bakery owners. Some U.S. businesses say the queues for a morning latte are already getting shorter as customers tighten their belts and imported beans become more expensive. Americans spend $100 billion, 76 billion pounds, a year on coffee, though that might be about to change. Jorge Prudencio, who runs Bread Bite Bakery in Washington, D.C., says his Colombia-based coffee distributor just increased prices after the sweeping tariffs went into effect last week. The vast majority of coffee in the U.S. is imported. In fact, the U.S. is the world's second leading importer of coffee, with the majority coming from Brazil and Colombia, according to the U.S. Department of Agriculture. Since April 5th, coffee imports have been affected by the 10% U.S. tariffs against most countries. Speaking to the BBC, Mr. Prudencio said his coffee suppliers have told him his next order will carry yet another price hike. He added that his bakery will definitely be increasing prices for customers just to break even. Asked if he is worried, Mr. Prudencio said, "Of course." The manager of a Le Café just down the street, Kamal Mortada, said he's been seeing the effect of steadily increasing prices for a while now. Inflation spiked to a 40-year high under former U.S. President Joe Biden. Before the tariffs kicked in, ground coffee reached the highest ever recorded price in March 2025 and was over $1 more expensive than the previous year and $3 above March 2020 prices. "We have less customers for coffee," Mr. Mortada said. "Most customers just get plain coffee instead of adding syrups and milks," he said. "Prices on the menu have gone up by 25% and people are now buying smaller coffees." Mr. Mortada has also changed his own habits as a consumer. Instead of his regular trip to Starbucks, he brews coffee at home. He said he has seen the price of a cup of coffee go up by at least $50, and is worried prices will rise again. On the opposite coast in San Francisco, another local coffee shop owner is grappling with what the tariffs will mean for her business. Jenny No, who runs Telescope Coffee, said she was waiting to hear how much her roaster will hike prices. Coffee she sells is sourced from Ethiopia and Guatemala, both facing the standard 10% tariff. She also imports her iced coffee cups from China, and said she noticed the prices on those jumped overnight. "We unfortunately project to raise prices again in order to sustain our business," she said. Mr. Prudencio remains confident that people will still come to his shop and buy coffee. He said it is something people need. But recent inflation has also affected the price of eggs, crucial to his bakery side of the business. He said they paid $42 per case when the bakery opened 5 months ago, but 2 weeks later it was more than $100 per case. Everybody is going through this same thing. We all pay the price. Price of eggs is a key symbol of the health of the U.S. economy, often an arguing point for politicians. President Donald Trump has argued he will get the cost of eggs down, blaming rising prices on the Biden administration, which culled millions of egg-laying chickens amid a bird flu outbreak. But in March, egg prices reached a record high at $6.22 per dozen, according to the Consumer Price Index. Joel Finkelstein runs Qualia Coffee Roasters, a small business in Washington, D.C. where he mostly sells coffee beans online and at farmers markets. "Tariffs will represent just the latest in a series of price hikes," he told us. He said he noticed the price of beans go up significantly after Trump took office and cut funding to USAID, which supported some coffee growers in South America. Now he's expecting it to go up again. "We are going to see a decrease in sales," Mr. Finkelstein said. Seasonal allergy sufferers are being hit with more pollen over a longer season due to rising temperatures, but global warming is also triggering alarming extreme allergy events, say experts. People could see the thunderstorm, but they couldn't see what was going on inside it. Trillions of pollen particles, sucked up into the clouds as the storm formed, were now being splintered by rain, lightning, and humidity into ever smaller fragments, then cast back down to Earth for people to breathe them in. It was around 1800 hours on November 21, 2016, when the air in Melbourne, Australia turned deadly. Emergency service phone lines lit up, people struggling to breathe began flooding into hospitals, and there was so much demand for ambulances that the vehicles were unable to reach patients stuck at home. Emergency rooms saw 8 times as many people turning up with breathing problems as they would normally expect. Nearly 10 times as many people with asthma were admitted to hospital. In total, 10 people died, including a 20-year-old law student who passed away on her lawn, waiting for an ambulance while her family tried to resuscitate her. One survivor described how he had been breathing normally and then, within 30 minutes, found himself gasping for air. "It was insane," he told reporters from his hospital bed. Paul Beggs, an environmental health scientist and professor at Macquarie University in Sydney, Australia, remembers the incident well. "It was an absolutely massive event. Unprecedented. Catastrophic," he says. "The people in Melbourne, the doctors and the nurses and the people in pharmacies, they all didn't know what was happening." It soon became clear that this was a massive case of thunderstorm asthma, which occurs when certain types of storms break up pollen particles in the air, releasing proteins and showering them on unsuspecting people below. The widely dispersed proteins can trigger allergic reactions in some people, even among those who weren't previously asthmatic. Thunderstorm asthma events like the one that hit Melbourne are one extreme example of how pollen from plants and the allergies it causes are being dramatically altered by climate change. As temperatures rise, many regions, especially the US, Europe, and Australia, are seeing seasonal allergies affect an increasing proportion of people over a longer season and with worse symptoms, say scientists. This year, in the US, pollen levels are predicted to be higher than the historical average across 39 states this season. And that is only likely to get worse in the years to come, experts warn. Pollen itself is an essential and ever-present part of our world. These microscopic particles pass between plants, enabling them to reproduce. While some plants spread their pollen with the help of insects, others rely on the wind, sending huge volumes of this powdery substance airborne. Many trees, grasses, and weed species rely upon wind dispersal for their pollen. It is these that are especially likely to cause seasonal allergies or hay fever. This occurs when your immune system mistakenly identifies the pollen as a harmful substance, triggering a response normally reserved for pathogenic bacteria or viruses. Common symptoms can include a runny nose, itchy eyes, and sneezing. In some cases, seasonal allergies can trigger breathing difficulties when inflammation in the airways leads to swelling, making it hard to get enough air into the lungs. While Melbourne has been the unlucky epicenter of thunderstorm asthma, with 7 thunderstorm asthma major events recorded since 1984, similar incidents have occurred around the world, from Birmingham in the UK to Atlanta in the US. Although these are still rare events, climate change may be increasing the likelihood of thunderstorm asthma incidents, in part because it is extending pollen seasons, but also because it is increasing the frequency of extreme weather events, including storms. While it isn't possible to determine exactly how much climate change influenced the 2016 thunderstorm asthma incident in Melbourne, Beggs is reasonably certain it had some impact. "We know that climate change is leading to greater amounts of pollen in the atmosphere," he says. "It's changing the seasonality of the pollen. It's changing the types of pollen that we're exposed to." Beggs, who has researched thunderstorm asthma extensively, published a paper in 2024 that examined the links between this phenomenon and climate change. Thankfully, major thunderstorm asthma events remain rare. But climate change is increasing people's risk of pollen exposure in other ways, too. For one thing, rising temperatures mean that pollen seasons, when plants emit pollen typically during spring and summer, are starting earlier and lasting longer, says Elaine Fuertes, a public health scientist who focuses on the environment and allergic disease at the National Heart and Lung Institute, Imperial College, UK. You're going to get people who experience symptoms earlier in the year for a longer period of time, she says. In parts of the world, including the US and Europe, one of the key culprits is ragweed, a widespread group of flowering plants that many people consider to be weeds. There are various species of ragweed around the world, but they can produce mind-bending amounts of pollen. A single plant is capable of emitting 1 billion pollen grains, for example. Ragweed grows in gardens and farmland, but also in nooks and crannies in urban environments. Allergies to ragweed pollen already affect some 50 million people in the US alone. A study analyzing data from 11 locations in North America between 1995 to 2015 found that 10 of those locations experienced longer ragweed pollen seasons, sometimes much longer. During that 20-year period, the season lengthened by 25 days in Winnipeg, Manitoba, 21 days in Fargo, North Dakota, and 18 days in Minneapolis, Minnesota. The winter warms, the springs are starting earlier, and the falls are being delayed, and so the time that you spend outdoors in contact with allergic pollen is definitely going up, says Louis Ziska, Associate Professor of Environmental Health Science at Columbia University in New York, US, and one of the scientists who researched the ragweed pollen season. These changes get more drastic in northern parts of North America, Europe, and Asia, Ziska says, but also in Australia and the southern parts of South America and Africa. Without immediate cuts to greenhouse gas emissions, the effect is likely to only get worse. One 2022 study, for example, estimated that by the end of the century, pollen seasons will begin up to 40 days earlier and end up to 15 days later than they do now, potentially meaning an additional 2 months of symptoms for hay fever sufferers per year. It isn't just that people are being exposed to allergens for longer. It is also that the amount of allergens in the air are increasing in many parts of the world. In the 2000s, the pollen season in the continental US started 3 days earlier than it did during the 1990s, but crucially, the amount of pollen in the air was also 46% higher. This is partly because carbon dioxide (CO2) levels in the atmosphere are rising due to emissions from human activities. And many of the most bothersome plants for hay fever sufferers thrive on CO2. When researchers grew a certain type of grass under different CO2 levels, for example, they found that plants grown in an atmosphere containing CO2 at 800 parts per million ppm had flowers that produced about 50% more pollen than plants grown in air containing 400 ppm. The latter mimics current levels of CO2 in Earth's atmosphere. Similarly, other scientists have also experimented with growing different types of oak tree, the pollen from which often causes hay fever in countries such as South Korea. Under a 720 ppm CO2 scenario, they found that each oak tree had an average pollen count 13 times what the trees had under a 400 ppm scenario. Even at 560 ppm, pollen production was 3.5 times higher than current levels. Ziska, who authored the 2022 book Greenhouse Planet, ran similar experiments with ragweed. His results mirror those of other researchers. Every time we cranked up the carbon dioxide, the ragweed plants responded. They grew more. They produced more pollen, he says. And there was some evidence that they were producing a more allergenic form of the pollen, one that could induce your immune system to respond even to a greater extent than had been in the past. The spread of invasive species across new parts of the world is also triggering allergic reactions in new populations of people. While originally from North America, ragweed, for example, has spread across Europe as well as into Australia, Asia, and South America. Already, some 60% of people in Hungary, 20% in Denmark, and 15% in the Netherlands are reportedly sensitive to the pollen from this prolific group of plants. This makes it especially concerning that, by 2050, the concentration of ragweed pollen in the air is estimated to be about 4 times what it is today. Even in parts of Europe where ragweed pollen is virtually absent at present, including southern UK and Germany, pollen loads become substantial under both moderate or high-end climate scenarios, researchers wrote in a 2015 study. About 1/3 of the increase is due to the continuing spread of the invasive species, the researchers note. The remaining 2/3 is specifically due to climate change, including the lengthening of the growing season as temperatures warm. So it'll be an earlier season, a longer season, as well as a more intense season for those who experience allergic symptoms, and then a higher risk of new sensitization for a previously unexposed population, Fuertes says. Not every region in the world will see more pollen production. Some researchers have found that Southern California, for example, will experience earlier but less productive pollen seasons, largely as a result of reduced rainfall. But these predictions don't account for all the potential effects of climate change on airborne allergens. There could also be health impacts from the increased likelihood of wildfires, for example, because this raises the risk of both asthma and allergy symptoms. Relatively speaking, the amount of pollen in the air will still vary from year to year, Fuertes points out. But that may not be of much help to hay fever sufferers. Once you're sensitized and go on to develop allergic symptoms, you'll still likely experience symptoms during years when pollen levels may be lower than average, she says. You'll react to the pollen that's around. So, what can people do about this? Cutting carbon emissions would help to avert some of the worst climate impacts, and other strategies might also mitigate the problem. It might be possible to make some drastic but direct interventions, for example. A century ago, some U.S. cities even set up commissions to tackle ragweed. Chicago employs 1,350 in hay fever fight, blares one headline from 1932. The news story explains that men, otherwise unemployed during the Great Depression, were paid the equivalent of 1 week's food and lodging and 25 cents in cash for each day they spent cutting down the plant. While this might sound quaint, it made a difference. A 1956 study of New York City's Operation Ragweed estimated that cutting down the plant in droves cut pollen production by about 50%. Today, it is in Europe where you can find coordinated action ongoing. In Berlin, workers have been dispatched to find and eliminate ragweed around the city, while Switzerland banned the import or sale of the plant in 2024 and established volunteer groups patrolling public parks to pull it out. Other solutions lie in smarter urban design. We should definitely green our cities, Fuertes says. But we do need to do it thoughtfully. Planting of exotic species, for example, can trigger new allergies. For the male, pollen-producing trees in some species over messy fruit and seed-producing female ones, so-called botanical sexism, can also increase pollen levels in urban areas, although studies have shown the effect of this bias is relatively small in major cities such as New York. It is also important to monitor and forecast pollen levels, scientists say. We need to know what we're breathing in. That's a pretty fundamental thing in terms of our health, says Beggs, who points out that while most people take it for granted that they can get reliable, real-time validated information on metrics like temperature or rainfall in their area, relatively few can say the same for airborne allergens. But even those services that are modeling pollen counts in an extensive, detailed way, such as the Finnish Meteorological Institute, aren't monitoring or modeling airborne allergen levels, which are more accurate as each pollen grain can release different amounts of allergens and they can vary by the weather conditions. These are a different measurement, Fuertes points out, and one that she's shown is more closely linked to allergy symptoms. Nobody is measuring allergen levels on a routine basis, Fuertes says. We should be moving towards that. Overall, experts say the science is clear. Without concrete, coordinated action, climate change will continue to make hay fever worse across many regions of the world. This might include more dramatic, deadly events like thunderstorm asthma. But it might also mean more people sniffling and suffering for a longer season every year. We have the studies now to show that it's really having an impact on human health, says Beggs. And there's more to come. Nintendo has been the talk of the gaming world this week after it finally unveiled details of the much-anticipated Nintendo Switch 2, the sequel to the third best-selling console ever made. Despite excitement over its upcoming launch in June, fan conversations have been dominated by one topic: the price of its games. Console itself is priced similarly to its rivals, Sony's PlayStation 5 and Microsoft's Xbox Series X. But the games are a different story. Mario Kart World, which is being launched alongside the Switch 2, comes in at £74.99. It makes it inaccessible. It's a lot to drop on one game, said Chloe Crossan, one of several gamers the BBC spoke to at a gaming store in Glasgow. She told the BBC she was excited about the console and its various games, but was concerned about the cost involved. "I guess you could argue you're paying for a game that 4 people could play," she said. "So there is that element, but it is £75 for a game, which is a lot. It's not expected that all of the Switch 2's titles will be so expensive, but charging so much for its best-known games still represents a big change in Nintendo's pricing strategy. It also risks confusing customers, as the same games can be purchased for different amounts depending on whether they are buying the physical game or the digital-only version." Experts don't think Mario Kart World will be a one-off. Christopher Dring, editor-in-chief and co-founder of the game business, said he expected to see price rises elsewhere too, particularly for the most anticipated titles, such as the latest edition of the Grand Theft Auto franchise. "I think if you're going to see a game that's going to be able to charge more, look out for when GTA 6 gets a release date later in the year," he said. He says there are lots of reasons prices might go up, part of which is that modern games are a lot of work. "These games are taking longer to make, they require more people to make them," he said. But there's also the fact, he says, that video game prices have not kept up with inflation. "I bought N64 games for £50 in the turn of the century, and that's £80 today," he pointed out. For some time, developers have got round that by monetizing transactions in games and relying more on cheaper digital downloads. But that process, Mr. Dring says, is running out of road. That growth has started to slow, so they're now relying on price increases. But it's clear those kinds of prices won't put everyone off. Another gamer the BBC spoke to, Catherine Brown, said she and her family were excited about the Switch 2 even if it was more expensive than usual. "If it gets good reviews and I wait until people have bought it first, then we'll think about it," she said. And Lewis Tucker, who's had the original Switch since the day it launched, said he would get the console as soon as he could afford it, despite the cost of the games. But he said considering the cost of game development nowadays, he was surprised it hadn't gone up in price sooner. But what will retailers make of it? Mr. Dring told the BBC this was the first time a console's physical and digital games were being priced differently. He said that could be a real blow for the people who sell the physical games. When a Nintendo Switch game releases, around 80% of its sales are in a box. If you compare that to Xbox, around 80% of new game sales are digital. By charging more for the physical copy, it's going to encourage people to download more, which will be good for Nintendo's bottom line. But of course it will be worse for the retailers who miss out on sales of the physical game. One thing Nintendo will be hoping to avoid replicating is the disastrous launch of its handheld 3DS in 2011. Came hot off the heels of the DS, the best-selling handheld in history, with fans seemingly desperate for an upgrade. But the price tag of over £200, more than double that of the original handheld, sparked consternation amongst fans who weren't willing to shell out so much for it. Within 6 months, Nintendo had slashed the price by almost half, and over time it picked up traction. It is fair to say the 3DS faced other problems such as a lackluster list of launch games, whereas the Switch 2 is launching with the first Mario Kart game in a decade. Nonetheless, Nintendo has formed with price decisions backfiring. The N64 launched at £250 back in 1997, and within a year it had tumbled down to £99. And in 2002, the firm cut £21 off its widely expected £150 price for the GameCube just 2 weeks before its launch. By bringing back the likes of Mario and Donkey Kong for the Switch 2, Nintendo has consciously looked to the past with its new console. It will be hoping it won't be forced to do the same with its decisions around prices. And that's going to do it for this episode of One Big Question with Renee Smith. Today's question really had me thinking, and I hope it did the same for you. Now, you already know the deal. If this conversation stirred up something in you, made you laugh, made you think, or made you text your group chat in all caps, go ahead and share it with someone who needs it. And hey, don't be shy, slide into those reviews and let me know what your big question is. You never know, it might just end up on a future episode. We drop new episodes every week, so be sure to follow or subscribe wherever you're listening. Same time, same place next week, we'll be right back at it with another question that just might change how you see the world. Until then, I'm Renee Smith. Stay curious, stay kind, and keep asking the big ones. Peace, y'all.